America was built on a promise written in bold words: freedom, equality, justice. These words were carved into history, repeated in speeches, taught to children as truth. But for millions of people, that promise never reached them. Not because it was delayed, not because it was misunderstood, but because it was never meant for them. For nearly 100 years, the law itself decided who deserved dignity and who deserved fear. This was not hatred hidden in shadows. This was racism standing in daylight, written into law, defended in courts, enforced by police. Children learned this truth before they learned hope. They learned which doors were closed, which streets were dangerous, which mistakes could cost a life. Parents did not teach dreams. They taught survival. How to stay quiet, how to stay invisible, how to stay alive. Every sign, every rule, every silence carried the same message: you do not belong. This was not chaos. It was a system that controlled movement, controlled opportunity, controlled fear, a system that decided who could rise and who must remain beneath. This story is not about one event. It is not about one villain. It is about what happens when power chooses comfort over justice, when silence becomes safety, and when forgetting becomes normal. This is the story of a nation that promised freedom and denied it. This is the story of Jim Crow. The year was 1865. The Civil War had ended. Slavery was officially abolished. Chains were broken. Whips were put down. The world said, freedom has arrived. But for Black Americans, freedom did not feel real. Because freedom without protection is not freedom at all. Formerly enslaved men and women stepped into a nation that had no place prepared for them. No land to stand on. No money to begin again. No law to protect their lives. They were told they were free, but they were surrounded by people who never accepted that truth. And when equality threatened power, power fought back. Southern states began writing new laws. Carefully, quietly, coldly. They were called Jim Crow laws. These laws did not openly say, black people are inferior. They did something worse. They proved it in daily life. Life was divided, piece by piece. Schools were separated. Black children sat in broken classrooms, under leaking roofs, with torn books passed down from white schools. They were not educated for opportunity. They were educated for obedience. Transportation was separated. On buses, black workers stood for hours after long days of labor, while empty seats stayed reserved. Hospitals were separated. Black patients waited longer, received less care, and died younger. Even water was separated. One fountain for white citizens, one for black citizens. And the signs were clear, not suggestions. Commands. Whites only. Colored. Every sign was a reminder. Know your place. The courts approved this system. The police enforced it. And the highest court in the land gave it a name that sounded fair. Separate but equal. But there was nothing equal about it. Jim Crow was not about separation. It was about control. Control of movement. Control of opportunity. Control of dignity. It taught black Americans that confidence was dangerous, that ambition was risky, that standing tall could cost a life. Parents warned their children where not to walk, how not to speak, when to look down, not because they lacked pride, but because they wanted their children to survive. This was not a broken system. It was a perfectly working one. A system designed to remind one group that they would always rule and another that they would always be reminded. And when humiliation was no longer enough, fear was waiting. Jim Crow controlled the daytime, but when the sun went down, fear took control. This was the side of America that did not need laws written on paper, because terror did the work. This was the era of lynching, a time when death did not require a crime. A rumor was enough. An accusation was enough. Sometimes, success itself was enough. A black man owning land, a black woman speaking confidently, a black family refusing to bow. that was seen as a threat. Mobs formed quickly, faces hidden in darkness, but intentions clear. Doors were kicked open in the middle of the night. Men were dragged from their beds while families screamed and begged. No trial, no defense, no mercy. Ropes were thrown over trees. Bodies were beaten, burned, and broken, left hanging as warnings. This violence was not hidden. It was public. Crowds gathered, men, women, even children. Photographs were taken. Smiles were captured. Postcards were printed. Souvenirs were collected. Police officers stood nearby, sometimes watching, sometimes participating. Judges remained silent. Politicians avoided the truth, because this was not chaos. This was enforcement. The message was clear and deliberate. Obey or die. Or die. Fear became part of daily life. Parents warned their children before they warned them about the world. Don't run. Don't argue. Don't look confident. Don't look angry. Learn to lower your eyes. Learn to soften your voice. Learn to disappear. Entire communities learned silence. Dreams were swallowed before they could grow. Ambition became dangerous. Success became a risk. This fear was not accidental. It was designed to keep workers obedient, voters away from the polls, and voices locked inside throats. Jim Crow did not need prisons alone. Fear was the prison. But fear has a weakness. It cannot erase dignity completely. Even under threat of death, something refused to die. A quiet anger. A buried courage. A belief that life could be more than survival. It lived in whispered conversations, in prayers spoken softly at night, in children who asked questions their parents were afraid to answer, because no system built on terror can last forever. And somewhere beneath the fear, beneath the silence, resistance was forming, waiting. Fear ruled for decades. It shaped lives. It shaped choices. It shaped silence. But fear could not erase dignity forever. Something began to change. Not suddenly, not loudly, but deeply. The resistance did not begin with weapons. It began with ordinary people making extraordinary decisions. People who were tired of surviving quietly, tired of lowering their eyes, tired of teaching their children fear. In 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, a woman named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus. She was not shouting. She was not violent. She was simply done. Her arrest was meant to be a warning. Instead, it became a spark. The black community stood together. For more than a year, they boycotted the buses. They walked miles every day. To work, to school, to church. They walked through rain, through heat, through threats. Some lost their jobs. Some were beaten. Some were arrested. Still, they walked. Across the South, students followed. Young men and women sat at lunch counters where they were told they did not belong. They were cursed at, spit on, pushed, punched. They did not fight back. They stayed seated. Children marched for education and dignity. Police unleashed dogs on them. Fire hoses knocked them to the ground. Jails filled with peaceful protesters. The system responded the only way it knew how, with violence. Churches were bombed. Homes were destroyed. Lives were threatened. Some paid the ultimate price. But something had changed. This time, the world was watching. Television cameras captured the truth. Not speeches, not explanations, but suffering. America could no longer look away. At the center of this movement rose voices that spoke not of revenge, but of justice. One of them was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He spoke of a dream, not as fantasy, but as a demand. A demand for equality, a demand for humanity. That dream frightened the system, because oppression survives in silence, and silence was breaking. Fear was no longer the only force. Courage had entered the room, and once courage appears, a system built on terror begins to crack. By the early 1960s, The pressure was impossible to ignore. For years, the nation had defended segregation as tradition, as order, as law. But now the truth was visible. Children being attacked by police dogs, peaceful marchers beaten in the streets, churches reduced to ashes. The world was watching, and America could no longer hide behind excuses. In 1964, after relentless protests and sacrifice, the Civil Rights Act was passed. Segregation in public spaces became illegal. Discrimination in employment was banned. For the first time in generations, the law stopped protecting injustice. 1 year later, in 1965, the Voting Rights Act followed. Poll taxes were outlawed. Literacy tests were abolished. Black Americans could finally vote without fear, at least in theory. On paper, Jim Crow was dead. The signs came down. The words, "whites only," disappeared. History declared victory. But reality moved slower than law. Neighborhoods remained divided. Schools stayed unequal. Opportunity was still out of reach for many. Segregation did not vanish. It retreated. It moved into housing policies, into banking practices, into job opportunities. Quietly denied, racism no longer shouted. It learned to whisper. And the cost of change was heavy. Leaders were threatened. Activists were jailed. Families lived in constant fear. Then, in 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. A bullet silenced a voice that had carried hope for millions. The nation mourned. But grief did not erase injustice. The movement had won laws, but it had not yet won healing. The system had changed its shape, not its impact. Jim Crow had fallen, but its shadow remained. And that shadow lived in economic inequality, in unequal education, in mistrust passed from generation to generation. Victory had arrived, but it was incomplete, because changing laws is easier than changing systems, and changing systems is easier than healing wounds. The fight had shifted, not from oppression to freedom, but from visible chains to invisible ones. And the story was not over. Jim Crow did not vanish. It changed its shape. The laws were erased. The signs were removed. The words "whites" only disappeared from walls. But the echo remained. Because systems do not die when laws change. They live on in habits and structures, in memory. For those who lived under Jim Crow, freedom did not arrive with celebration. It arrived with caution. Parents still warned their children. Communities still remembered fear. Trust did not return overnight. The wounds were too deep. Generations had been taught survival, not possibility. The damage was not only physical, it was psychological. It lived in lowered expectations, in opportunities never offered, in futures quietly limited. And while history books closed the chapter, real life carried the consequences. The legacy of Jim Crow lived on, in unequal schools, unequal neighborhoods, unequal access to justice. It lived in mistrust between communities and institutions that had once enforced oppression. This is why the past still matters, not to assign guilt, but to understand responsibility. Because injustice does not repeat exactly the same way. It adapts. It learns new language. It hides behind policy. It blends into normal life. Jim Crow proved one dangerous truth. Oppression does not survive on hatred alone. It survives on silence, on comfort, on forgetting, and forgetting is easy. It is easier to believe that progress means completion. But progress without memory is fragile. The people who resisted Jim Crow did not fight for statues or speeches. They fought so their children would not have to live in fear. They paid with their bodies, with their freedom, with their lives. Their courage broke a system that claimed to be unbreakable. And now, the responsibility remains. To remember, to question, to refuse silence, because every generation faces its own test, not of words, but of action. And history does not ask what we believed. It asks what we accepted. Pause. Jim Crow is not just a story of the past. It is a mirror, and the reflection is still watching.